Bitcoin can never be copied, and its success cannot be replicated. And there's a very good reason for this being the case. My central argument here is that digital scarcity was only a discovery that could be made once. And this is not an original argument. Others have made this point, but I'm simply going to formulate it in my own words. When Bitcoin was released into the wild in 2009, the operating assumption of basically everyone in the world, including the foremost experts in finance, economics, cryptography, we're talking PhDs, we're talking geniuses, everyone knew that digital scarcity was impossible. There was just the problem in which information can be copied, and therefore you can't have scarcity, because as soon as you have that one digital object, you can just copy it and it's no longer scarce. And this is the one exception to that would be you can have digital scarcity within a centralized closed system. So if you look at a game such as let's say World of Warcraft. In World of Warcraft, you can have digital scarcity. You can have that one sword that there's only one of them in the game, and no other player can get it because the centralized authority over at Blizzard, they can arrange for that to happen. But of course, the problem is that as soon as that central authority decides to, they can at any time unilaterally decide to destroy the digital scarcity of that digital object. And so what we're really talking about here is decentralized digital scarcity was never, people had tried to create it, and it was never successful. It was just assumed, therefore, that it was just not possible. And this is the mindset, the world in which Bitcoin was released into. This is critical because it set up a situation in which there was not immediately a monopoly control set up over Bitcoin. There was not immediately someone who came in and cornered the market. Because if it was accepted, if everyone recognized that this was actually possible, and that Bitcoin would be a success, and that Bitcoin would grow, let's not even talk about what we think that Bitcoin is going to ultimately become, but no one could have possibly imagined, or everyone discounted even the possibility that it would get to the point that it is now in 2021. If anyone had fathomed that that was really possible in 2009, they immediately would have come in, just set up all the miners they could, sucked up all the supply, and hoarded it for themselves. And of course, the paradox of this is because someone cornered the Bitcoin market, because someone set up a monopoly over its supply, Bitcoin would have failed. Bitcoin would have failed as money. No one would have been attracted to it. But that is not what happened, because the world, except for a few crazy people, an extreme minority, one person in a million, or maybe even one person in 10 million, thought maybe Bitcoin could work. But even they did not attempt to corner the market. They just played around with Bitcoin. Bitcoin having having no price, having a $0 fiat price at that time was critical for it being fairly distributed. The only reason why this was the case and why the early distribution of Bitcoin was fair is because everyone just knew that digital scarcity was self-evidently impossible. I know that I first became aware of Bitcoin around, let's say, 2014, and it was around $100, went up to $1,000, and I dismissed it because obviously this thing was going to fail because digital scarcity is impossible. This is the only reason why, in those critical early years when Bitcoin was not even a sapling, but it was still a seed, it was germinating. The only reason that it survived is because it was still in the soil. It was still hidden from sight, from people's awareness, at least for the vast majority of people. And that's why in that environment it was able to survive. With Bitcoin, there was no VCs, there was no pre-sale, there was no institutional investors who bought it up and then are going to dump it on retail investors during an IPO. There was none of that. And crucially, the creator of Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto, did not enrich himself, even though he had the perfect opportunity to do so. If there was anyone who could have cornered the Bitcoin supply, it was him, and he chose not to. He mined something like 1 million Bitcoin in the very absolute beginnings of Bitcoin's existence. And that Bitcoin has never been moved. It has never been sold. It has never been transferred. In all likelihood, the keys have been destroyed because I think that Satoshi Nakamoto realized that for Bitcoin to succeed, it had to have universal consensus by all of humanity that its initial distribution was fair. And I think the true brilliance of Nakamoto was in walking away and refusing to enrich himself, which provides the credibility of Bitcoin as money, because in those early days no one created a monopoly, no one monopolized the supply. This is not how assets behave typically. This is not how securities behave. Bitcoin was organic. It truly was organic in a way that no other cryptocurrency can even begin to compare to, and in a way in which traditional financial assets just obviously there's no comparison. They do not have the properties of Bitcoin in the way that Bitcoin organically manifested itself. It is as if it was released into the wilderness by Satoshi Nakamoto. Now, I don't want to take credit away from Satoshi Nakamoto, and nor do I want to take credit away from the early developers who supported Bitcoin and the early adopters. Bitcoin was created, but there is also this sense in which it is as if it just fell from the sky out of nowhere, just dropped onto this earth, and then began to tick. It began to operate. It began to grow, to expand on its own, organically. There's no marketing team. There's no headquarters. There's no it just kind of, it's this organism, this digital organism that is just evolving on its own. Yes, with the input from humans, of course, but there is this organic composition to Bitcoin that simply no other cryptocurrency can begin to compare with. And that's the critical distinction. That is what makes Bitcoin digital gold. When I'm talking about the early distribution of Bitcoin being so critical and how organic it was, the only financial asset that, of course, compares to this or has any equivalency is gold, because gold had that same wide distribution, really no barriers to entry. Just anyone with any panner could go with his pan down to the river and pan for gold, and it was across the world. Every continent had gold, and this is kind of how gold organically grew to become money, because it wasn't just one country or one state from thousands of years ago that unilaterally decided that gold was money. It's because gold was money because it was organically distributed. Gold was money because there was originally no central monopoly. There was no central, no one cornered the market on gold. And that's why gold was, notice I say was, gold was money for 5,000 years for this very reason. That critical origin story, that critical, it's almost like a creation myth of Bitcoin in those early years. That is what separates Bitcoin. That is what makes it a once in a history event that cannot be ever replicated, because now that humanity knows that digital scarcity is possible, then the game theory of it is that as soon as digital scarcity is discovered in nature, the incentive is to immediately corner the market, obtain all the supply, and when you do that, you kill the value of that digital scarcity as money, because it's not fairly distributed. It's just all in the hands of one group. So let's ignore the altcoins for now. Let's set that aside and talk about that in a minute. First, let's just pretend that from the sky, another form of digital scarcity suddenly fell to the ground, and we don't know where it came from, but it happened today in 2021. Well, because humanity knows that digital scarcity is possible, we would all, the first person to discover it would immediately hoard the supply, would immediately just try to gain control of as much of it as possible. And that demonstrates how it doesn't even matter if digital scarcity has no inventor, if it has no kind of like ICO event or whatever, and it literally just drops from the sky. Even then, you cannot replicate Bitcoin, because now the incentives, the game theory of it, is to immediately accumulate it all, corner the market, create a monopoly, and then its value as money is zero. You kill the idea of digital scarcity uh, kills itself in that sense. It kind of self sterilizes, and that's why I say that the the environment in which Bitcoin was it's very early childhood, in which everyone just discounted it as even being possible, metaphysically possible, scientifically possible. That created this environment in which people were just willing to uh, trade and send and lose these Bitcoin, this absolute digital scarcity. It distributed very fairly for this reason, because no one recognized what they were dealing with, and that's where you get the $10,000 Bitcoin pizza from, because no one recognized the true value of being able to own this fraction of digital scarcity. And by the way, the whole Bitcoin Lambos meme is just another form of Bitcoin's ability to fairly distribute its supply across humanity. Because back in the 2013 bubble, back in the 2017 bubble, when you had this massive run up in Bitcoin's fiat denominated price, what happened with so many of the people who got in early to Bitcoin? They cashed in their Bitcoin, they distributed it to other people, and then just bought junk like Lambos or whatever. But the point is that these Bitcoin bull markets are a form of Bitcoin shaking out whales and distributing the supply more widely. Now, that was critical for the fair distribution. By the way, just a note, something does not have to be equal to be fair. There is no equality in nature. Anywhere we look, there's no equality in nature. A fair distribution does not equate to an equitable distribution. And maybe we can talk about that later, but let's just note that for a minute. Because Bitcoin is not equitably distributed, and it never, ever will be. The Pareto principle applies to this, the 80-20 rule. 20% of the people are always going to own 80% of the wealth. It has always been that way, and it always will be. There was always going to be a high concentration of Bitcoin held by a roughly like a 20%. The trick with Bitcoin will be to make sure that that does not grow too small. That's another story though. So let's go to altcoins, okay? Why are they not able to replicate the absolute digital scarcity that Bitcoin accomplishes, that Bitcoin is? In other words, why do I argue that Bitcoin was a one-off event, a one-time occurrence? We are going to continue this discussion in part 2.